Nobody believed Prussia would win. That's the part that gets forgotten. In the spring of 1866, when Otto von Bismarck maneuvered his country into war with Austria, the consensus across Europe was that he had lost his mind. Austria was the dominant power in the German world, the empire that had kept Europe in order since Napoleon, the state whose armies had fought and won across 2 centuries. Prussia was a second-tier military kingdom, with a chancellor known for bad temper and radical ideas. French military observers, British diplomats, the Austrian court, all of them expected the same outcome. Prussia would overreach, get crushed, and Bismarck would be dismissed or hanged. The war lasted 7 weeks. Austria lost 44,000 men at a single battle. Prussia's casualties at the same battle numbered around 9,000. By the time it was over, Austria was expelled from German affairs permanently. The old European order was shattered, and every general on the continent was scrambling to understand what had just happened to them. What had happened was Helmuth von Moltke and a rifle that could fire 6 times a minute. But the real story starts 4 years earlier, with a politician who understood something nobody else in Europe did, that the balance of power was about to break, and that the only question was who would break it first. Otto von Bismarck became Minister-President of Prussia in September 1862, appointed by King Wilhelm I as a last resort during a constitutional crisis over military funding. The Prussian parliament had refused to approve the army budget. The king needed someone willing to govern without parliamentary approval, to push the military reforms through by force of will. Bismarck was willing. He was also 52 years old, had served as a diplomat but never held executive power, and was regarded by most European statesmen as a dangerous radical with no real plan. His first speech to the parliament days after taking office contained a sentence that became famous and was immediately used against him. The great questions of the day will not be settled by speeches and majority votes. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood. The parliament was appalled. The press mocked him. The liberal opposition saw him as a Junker reactionary who would drive Prussia into catastrophe. What they missed was that Bismarck had already worked out, with extraordinary precision, exactly what he was going to do, and in what order. He was going to provoke a war with Austria. He was going to win it, and before he fired a single shot, he was going to make absolutely sure that no other great power would intervene to save Vienna. This was not recklessness. It was a diplomatic operation that took 4 years. Russia first. Prussia had stood by Russia during the Polish uprising of 1863, quietly supporting the Tsar, while the rest of Europe protested. Alexander II was grateful. Russia would not help Austria in a war with Prussia. France next. In October 1865, Bismarck traveled to Biarritz on the Atlantic coast for a series of private meetings with Napoleon III. The French emperor was shrewd but vain, and Bismarck spent several days making him feel like a partner in reshaping Europe. The conversations happened mostly in walks along the beach and in private dinners. Bismarck committed nothing to writing, which was the point. Napoleon left Biarritz believing France would receive territorial compensation along the Rhine if Prussia won a war with Austria. He agreed to stay neutral. What he did not understand, because Bismarck had been careful never to say it explicitly, was that Prussia had no intention of honoring any vague promise about the Rhine. Bismarck had bought neutrality with a currency that didn't exist. 4 years later, when Napoleon finally realized this and demanded what he thought he'd been promised, Bismarck leaked the request to the German states and overnight turned Prussia's former enemies into allies against France. Italy last. In April 1866, Bismarck signed a secret treaty with the newly unified Italian kingdom. If war with Austria broke out within 3 months, Italy would attack from the south, forcing Austria to fight on 2 fronts. In exchange, Prussia would ensure Italy received Venetia. The 3-month clock started ticking. By the spring of 1866, Austria was diplomatically isolated. Russia would not move. France would watch. Italy was waiting for the signal. Bismarck had built a cage around Austria without anyone inside it realizing what was happening. Now he needed a pretext. The pretext was Schleswig-Holstein. Two small duchies, Prussia and Austria, had jointly seized from Denmark in 1864 and had been jointly administering ever since in a state of managed tension. Bismarck had designed the joint administration to be contentious from the start, a slow-burning fuse he could light whenever he chose. In June 1866, he lit it. Prussia accused Austria of violating the terms of the joint administration in Holstein. Austria appealed to the German Confederation, the loose alliance of German states, to mobilize against Prussian aggression. The Confederation voted to support Austria. Bismarck immediately declared the Confederation dissolved and prepared for war. The Austrian court looked at the situation with confidence that read, in hindsight, like a kind of blindness. They expected the war to unfold as previous European wars had unfolded: slow mobilization, diplomatic maneuvering, battles in set-piece formations between roughly equal forces, eventually a negotiated settlement. They had a capable army. They had Saxon and Bavarian allies. They had the moral support of most of the German world. What they did not have was Helmuth von Moltke or the Dries needle gun, and these two things were going to end the world they thought they lived in. Moltke had been chief of the Prussian General Staff since 1857, and he had spent nearly a decade quietly building something that had never existed before: a modern military machine. His innovations were not about courage or morale or the martial spirit. The Prussians had plenty of all of those. His innovations were about time and information. He had personally mapped the Prussian railway network and calculated exactly how many soldiers could be moved to which positions in how many days. The numbers were precise to the hour. He had run exercises with his staff, testing scenarios, identifying bottlenecks, revising the calculations. By 1866, he knew to the day how long it would take to concentrate 3 armies on the Bohemian border. He had created a telegraph communication system that allowed him to issue orders simultaneously to corps commanders hundreds of miles apart. He had trained a generation of officers not to wait for instructions from headquarters, but to assess their situation, understand the overall objective, and act, a doctrine so foreign to the military culture of the time that Austrian observers who heard about it dismissed it as an invitation to chaos. When the war began on June 15, 1866, Moltke moved 3 Prussian armies into Bohemia, along separate railways, converging on a single point like the arms of a closing vice. The Austrian commander, General Ludwig von Benedek, watched Prussian forces cross the border from 3 directions simultaneously and had no idea which column was the main thrust. Because all 3 were the main thrust, he tried to concentrate his forces at a central position and destroy one Prussian army before the others arrived. He never got the chance. The needle gun was the other half of the catastrophe. The Dries needle gun was not new in 1866. Prussia had been issuing it to infantry since the 1840s. The Austrians knew it existed. What they did not fully understand, because they had not thought through the tactical implications carefully enough, was what it meant in a battle. An Austrian infantryman with a muzzle-loading rifle had to stand upright to reload. He poured powder down the barrel, rammed a ball after it, cocked the hammer, and fired, a sequence that took 30 seconds under ideal conditions, and considerably longer under fire, with shaking hands and a fouled barrel and men dying next to him. The Dries needle gun was a breech loader. A Prussian soldier could reload it lying on the ground, behind cover, in 10 seconds. He could fire 6 rounds per minute. The Austrian could manage 2, standing exposed in the open. Austrian officers knew this in the abstract, but they clung to the tactical doctrine that had served European armies for a century: massed infantry formations, advancing with fixed bayonets, shock and momentum carrying the assault. The theory was that disciplined men moving forward at pace would reach the enemy line before enough of them were shot to stop the advance. Against muzzle loaders firing twice a minute, the theory sometimes held. Against needle guns firing 6 times a minute, it was systematic slaughter. One Austrian officer who survived the campaign wrote that the first time he led his company in a bayonet charge, the Prussian fire was so heavy and so continuous that the formation simply dissolved before it reached the enemy line. Men fell on his right and left simultaneously. Within 40 seconds, the company had lost a third of its strength and nobody had reached anything. The Prussians were prone behind rocks and trees, invisible, reloading in 10 seconds and firing again. His report was one of dozens that said essentially the same thing. An Austrian letter captured early in the campaign contained a line that German officers quoted for years afterward. A young soldier had written home, "Dear Mother, I don't think I'll be coming back because the Prussians are shooting everyone dead." He was not wrong. At every engagement in the opening weeks of the campaign, Austrian formations advanced in close order and were torn apart by Prussian fire from troops they often couldn't see. Austrian casualties ran 3 to 4 times higher than Prussian at every engagement. Benedek, a competent general who had been assigned to the Bohemian front, despite having spent his career in Italy and having no familiarity with either the terrain or his own troops, began to understand the scale of the disaster by late June. On July 1st, he sent a telegram to Emperor Franz Joseph. "I urgently beg your majesty to make peace at any price. A catastrophe is inevitable." Franz Joseph telegraphed back, asking if a battle had taken place. Benedek interpreted this as an order to stand and fight. He drew his army up along the Elbe River between the village of Sadowa and the fortress of Königgrätz and waited. Moltke had found him. The night before the battle, 2 Prussian officers rode through the dark for 20 miles carrying handwritten orders from Moltke's headquarters to the Crown Prince's Second Army. The telegraph lines were down. Moltke needed the Second Army at Königgrätz by morning to close the encirclement for Zichelin. Without it, the First Army would attack a force roughly equal in size to its own and might not break through. The 2 officers rode. The orders got through. The Second Army marched through the night. At dawn on July 3, 1866, King Wilhelm I of Prussia arrived at the battlefield, accompanied by Bismarck and Moltke. They established themselves on a hill overlooking the Elbe Valley, from which they could watch the battle unfold below. Bismarck later wrote that he had never been more frightened in his life than during those morning hours, watching the Prussian First Army fight its way across the Biarritz River against entrenched Austrian positions, while the Second Army was still somewhere to the north, marching hard, not yet visible. The First Army crossed the river at 6:30 in the morning. The fighting in the Sweepwald, the dense forest on the right of the Austrian position, was vicious and confused, the needle gun advantage partially offset by terrain that reduced visibility to a few yards. Austrian artillery, which was actually superior to Prussian artillery in this battle, pounded the Prussian lines. By mid-morning, Moltke's First Army was pinned. It was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, holding Benedek in place, but the cost was mounting and the Second Army had not appeared. Bismarck rode forward on horseback to get a better view. A Prussian officer suggested he was within range of Austrian guns. Bismarck replied that he had not come all this way to miss the decisive battle. He lit a cigar and stayed where he was. His uniform was a major's, the lowest officer rank, which was all his civilian status entitled him to wear, and he cut an incongruous figure on the hill above the battle, a politician in a military coat watching the fate of Prussia being decided below him by men who had spent their careers preparing for this moment, while he had spent his years working in chancelleries and foreign ministries. At 11:30 in the morning, a staff officer rode up with a report. The Crown Prince's Second Army was on the Austrian right flank. 105,000 men who had marched through the night, deploying into line, rolling up the Austrian position from the north, while the First Army held them from the west. The Austrian right disintegrated within 2 hours. By 3 in the afternoon, Benedek ordered a general retreat. It became a rout. Austrian formations that had held their lines all morning broke and ran for the bridges over the Elbe, pursued by Prussian cavalry. The road from the battlefield to Königgrätz was covered in abandoned equipment, dead horses, and men who had simply stopped running. Austrian casualties on July 3rd alone reached 44,000, killed, wounded, captured, missing. Prussian casualties were just under 9,000. The Prussian king, watching the Austrian army dissolve on the plain below him, turned to his generals with the eagerness of a man who wanted to follow up the victory immediately, march on Vienna, dictate terms in the Austrian capital. His commanders agreed. This was the moment. Austria was shattered. Germany lay open. The war could end in a week with Prussia supreme from the Baltic to the Danube. Bismarck said no. This is the part of the story that separates Bismarck from every other nationalist demagogue in the 19th century. He had started the war, maneuvered for 4 years to make it possible, watched it unfold from a hillside with a cigar, and now, at the moment of total victory, he was the one demanding restraint, not out of mercy or sentimentality, out of calculation. Napoleon III had already dispatched a French envoy to Prussian headquarters, demanding an armistice and hinting that France would intervene if Prussia pressed too far. The French army was mobilizing. If the war continued for another month, it would stop being a Prussian victory over Austria and start being a European conflict that might cost Prussia everything it had won. Bismarck needed Austria humiliated but not destroyed. A destroyed Austria would be replaced by something worse from Prussia's perspective: French influence in Central Europe, or a Habsburg collapse into chaos that would drag in every power on the continent. He had screaming arguments with his king. He told the Crown Prince that if his demands for a march on Vienna were not dropped, Bismarck would throw himself out of the nearest window. Whether he meant it is unclear, but he won the argument. The armistice was signed on July 22nd, 1866. The Peace of Prague followed on August 23rd. The terms were strikingly moderate by the standards of the century. Austria paid a small indemnity. Austria ceded Venetia to Italy. Austria was excluded from the German Confederation, which was dissolved. Prussia annexed 4 German states that had fought on Austria's side, and that was essentially it. No Austrian territory east of Bohemia changed hands. No Habsburg archdukes were forced to bend the knee in Berlin. Bismarck had gotten exactly what he wanted: Austria out of Germany. Nothing more, nothing less. The moderation of the peace terms shocked his own generals. They had marched 400 miles in 7 weeks, destroyed the Austrian army, stood within striking distance of Vienna. They wanted annexations, indemnities, the public humiliation of the Habsburg court. Bismarck gave them almost none of it. One general reportedly said he felt like a man who had broken into a house and been told to leave with only his hat. Bismarck didn't argue. He had Austria exactly where he needed it: weakened, excluded, and not so humiliated that it would spend the next decade trying to reverse the verdict by allying with France. The reaction in Paris was panic dressed as outrage. Napoleon III had expected a long war that would exhaust both Prussia and Austria, leaving France to collect whatever territorial compensation it wanted along the Rhine. Instead, the war had lasted 7 weeks and left Prussia dramatically stronger, with no need of French approval for anything. French newspapers coined the phrase "revenge for Sadowa." The French army began frantically studying Prussian tactics. German observers at the battle noted in their reports. Officers who had watched the needle gun perform at Königgrätz started writing memorials about breech-loading rifles and railroad mobilization. The entire military doctrine of Europe was in sudden, urgent question. What followed from Sadowa was a chain of consequences that unfolded with the logic of falling dominoes, each one larger than the last. Prussia formed the North German Confederation in 1867, uniting 22 German states under Prussian leadership. The southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, remained formally separate but signed secret military treaties with Prussia. Bismarck had what he needed. He now turned to the final piece of the puzzle: France. Napoleon III, humiliated and desperate for a success that would restore his prestige, blundered into a crisis over the Spanish throne in 1870 that Bismarck had helped engineer. France declared war on Prussia. The southern German states, bound by their secret treaties, mobilized alongside Prussia. The Franco-Prussian War lasted less than a year. The French army was destroyed at Sedan. Napoleon III surrendered in person. Paris was besieged for 4 months, and in January 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the German Empire was proclaimed with Wilhelm I as Kaiser. Bismarck had taken Prussia from a second-tier kingdom to the dominant power in Europe in 9 years. He did it with 3 short wars and the most precise diplomatic preparation in the history of 19th century statecraft. The instrument of all of it was the Battle of Königgrätz. In the memory of the French, it was Sadowa, the battle they needed to avenge and couldn't. In Austrian memory, it was the catastrophe Benedict had begged the emperor to prevent. In Prussian memory, it was the proof that Moltke's system worked. that a modern military machine built around railways, telegraphs, and breech-loading rifles could defeat a larger empire in 7 weeks. Benedek lived until 1881, broken by the defeat. He had been ordered by the emperor never to speak publicly about what happened at Königgrätz. Franz Josef feared that the truth about how reluctantly Benedek had taken command, how clearly he had seen the catastrophe coming, and how accurately he had predicted it in his telegrams, would damage the monarchy's prestige. Benedek honored the order in silence for 15 years. His reputation was destroyed. Austrian newspapers blamed him for the defeat. He gave no interviews, published no memoirs, made no public statements. When he finally died, the full picture only emerged slowly, from letters and private papers his family eventually released. The needle gun itself was obsolete within a decade. The French had developed a better breech loader, the chassepot, which they deployed in 1870, and lost anyway, because weapons were never really the point. The Prussian advantage at Königgrätz wasn't primarily the rifle. It was Moltke's ability to move 3 armies by rail to a single point and coordinate them across a 270-mile front with the telegraph. It was the training of officers to act independently within a larger plan. It was the general staff system that Moltke had built over 9 years and that every other military in Europe spent the next 50 years trying to copy. The Austrian military attaché in Berlin filed a report after the battle that is still quoted in military history courses. He wrote that Prussia had demonstrated a new form of warfare, and that every European power needed to understand it immediately or face the same consequences Austria had just suffered. His report was filed, read by several senior officers, and largely ignored. 4 years later, France found out what ignoring it felt like. Bismarck watched the German Empire proclaimed at Versailles in his general's uniform, standing behind his king in the Hall of Mirrors. He wrote afterward that he had wept, not from joy, he said, but from something more complicated. The Germany that had been proclaimed was not exactly the Germany he had wanted. It was larger, more triumphant, more dangerous than he had planned. He had wanted a controlled transformation. What he had produced was a revolution, and revolutions have a way of going further than the men who start them intend. In 1866, standing on a hill above the Elbe with his cigar while Austrian cavalry broke and ran through the afternoon smoke, he had thought it was finished. The cage was closed. The result was secured. What came next was containment, management, the careful maintenance of the new order he had built. He was right that the cage was closed. He was wrong that the result was secured. The Germany born at Königgrätz was a country that had learned it could solve its problems in 7 weeks, through iron and blood, faster than anyone expected, and before anyone could intervene to stop it. That lesson took another 50 years to finish teaching.